Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the imaginary unit, the square root of -1, which is I. And again, that's called the imaginary unit. How did mathematicians come up with this? Well, they were considering this equation here. What's the solution to this? Or the solutions, the two solutions? Well, to solve this, when we have an x squared, we could subtract 1 from both sides, and we get x squared equals -1. Now, before there were complex numbers, keep in mind that mathematicians, all we thought about were real numbers. And the question is, what real number squared or what real number multiplied twice gives us -1? Well, the answer isn't 1 because 1 times 1 is 1. The answer isn't -1 either because -1 times -1 is +1. There's no real number that satisfies this equation. However, if we just continue and take the square root, use the square root property, take the square root of both sides, we get plus and minus the square root of -1. And they said, well, this is the solution. And then they defined the square root of -1 to be I. Now, another important thing here, these imaginary numbers that come up when we solve equations and work with functions. When we say imaginary, it doesn't mean it's like pretend floating around out there in our imagination. It's imaginary numbers or complex numbers are just as real as any other number. It's just that, like I was saying, before we came up with imaginary numbers, the only number type we had were real numbers, and they thought, well, what should we call this new number? We've got our real numbers, how about imaginary? But again, it doesn't mean it's pretend or it's just imaginary. It's just as real as any other number. When we build bridges or whatever, and the equations we solve, they end up with imaginary solutions. Bridges still stand, the universe still works, the world is still here. They're just as real as any other number. We just call them imaginary numbers.